Questions can be answered. Okay, I've got my pop-up screen. Questions can be entered into the chat in Zoom today, and we'll do our best to field these as time permits. The chat function can be located at the bottom navigation bar in Zoom. Comments can be submitted to Commerce using the form we posted on our webpage. I really want to reiterate that we value your input and your comments. We actively use this information to better shape administrative rules to meet your needs, so please continue to be engaged throughout the process. Next slide, please. Commerce's mission is to strengthen communities, and we do this through a broad range of policy and programs, including housing and homelessness, small business assistance, community services, and energy, to name a few. Next slide. I wanted to provide just real brief introductions to our team. So our entire team is dedicated to providing timely, actionable, and clear information about the state's Clean Buildings Law. My name is Emily Salzberg, and I'm the Managing Director for the Buildings Unit within the State Energy Office. Your presenters for today are going to be Judy Darst, Donnie Westfall, and Luke Howard, who are our technical leads for Clean Buildings. You'll also be hearing from Annalyn Bergen and Annika McDonald, who are our program managers, and they focus much of their time on the incentive program, outreach and education, and communications, and apparently dad jokes as well. We work with a talented team of staff focused on database development, policy development, and program implementation. Next slide, please. So today we plan to provide a comprehensive review of proposed rules in today's workshop. The discussion today will aggregate all topics and comments that we've received to date. We'll review both Tier 2 proposed rules and Tier 1 proposed clarifications and changes. These Tier 1 proposed changes reflect comments that we've heard from stakeholders in the industry over the last several years. We will then have time for discussion and Q&A at the end of today's workshop. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes all of our workshops that we've hosted to date as part of rulemaking. Following this workshop, we'll also be hosting a series of in-person meetings next week in Seattle, Spokane, and Kennewick. That'll be September 11th through the 13th. If anybody is interested in attending in person, we plan to cover similar content to today's presentation, and we'll have time for more focused discussion and engagement. Regarding rulemaking, we've been releasing draft language with each workshop and then hosting a public comment period on each topic for about 2 weeks following the workshop. We're focused on this process being inclusive and participatory. We welcome everyone to submit comments, and we'll do our best to reflect this input in our final rule set. Next slide, please. So I want to take just a brief moment to discuss the time between our final workshop and rules becoming effective. So during this time, we'll host those in-person meetings, as I mentioned, this next week around the state. We'll be reviewing all comments to determine what we have authority to incorporate into our rule set based on the law as written. We'll finalize our small business economic impact statement and file the CR 102 form. We'll conduct the public hearing, which will take place on November 21st. And we'll file the CR 103, which will be followed by the rules being adopted in December. Next slide, please. This slide is a summary of the main components of Senate Bill 5722 and Tier 2 requirements. Commerce must launch a $150 million incentive program with a base incentive payment of 30 cents per square foot. We must provide customer support and technical assistance. The bill includes a directive that there must be enhanced assistance to under-resourced buildings and communities. The first phase of this law is focused on benchmarking, operations and maintenance, and energy management planning. Very important to note that it's not a performance standard at this time. The law directs Commerce to assess penalty fines for buildings that are not in compliance with the reporting requirements, which will not exceed 30 cents per square foot. Commerce will be required to analyze benchmarking data for Tier 2 buildings and to make a recommendation to the legislature as to whether there should be a performance standard for Tier 2 buildings, which would require rulemaking in 2029. The law requires us to complete a small business economic impact statement for both this current rulemaking and the 2029 rulemaking as well. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a brief summary of the differences between Tier 1 and Tier 2 buildings. Luke will go into this in much more detail later in the workshop. Tier 1 buildings are buildings over 50,000 square feet and do not include multifamily buildings. Tier 2 buildings are buildings between 20 and 50,000 square feet, and all multifamily buildings over 20,000 square feet. Tier 2 buildings will not be required to meet a performance standard or target during the first phase of this law. So now I am handing it over to Annalyn or Donnie, I think, to talk about public comments that we've received to date.
It's me. Thanks, Emily. Appreciate it. Okay, hello, everyone. I'm Annalyn Bergen. I'm, like Emily said, I'm one of the program managers for the Clean Buildings team. I'm going to summarize the public comments received since the last workshop, which covered Tier 1 amendments. You can view all of these comments that we received on the comment dashboard, and we'll enter the link into the chat, so you'll be able to click and read the comments received. It's also posted on our Clean Buildings homepage. So before we review the comments, I'd like to give a summary of the stakeholder engagement and comments received during this rulemaking, since this is going to be our final workshop. Next one. Next slide, please. So we have had 5 workshops attended by various industries. You can see the list to the right, and to the bottom left, you can see that the workshops had great attendance. As of yesterday, we've only received 38 comments. The top topics covering building configuration and compliance, the cost of implementation, and the need for technical support, especially with the operations and maintenance program and the energy management plans. It's not too late to submit comments. Please send us your comments of support, concern, or suggested edits. Next slide. So since the previous workshop, we received comments that supported our efforts to align Tier 1 requirements with Tier 2. Based on the comments received, there remains some confusion on the connected buildings designation. It was suggested to not have the largest buildings determine the compliance date, but rather make the program centric to individual buildings. Later during this workshop, Luke will probably go over an example of a connected building. So we received comments. We've also received comments regarding affordable housing and the incentive program. The stakeholders suggested to allow the managing member and general partner of the owner receive payments rather than the owner, to prevent interference with low-income housing tax credit financing. The incentive program development will be scheduled after these rulemaking workshops. We hope you can join us. Annika will speak more about this later in the presentation. Next slide. So we received suggestion from a stakeholder from the healthcare industry. They provided different scenarios and asked Commerce if we would consider expanding the responsible party for reporting connected buildings to an owners association or a utility account owner. And that's all of the comments received since previous workshop. Next slide. So for this part of the presentation, we'll focus strictly on Tier 2. I'll start off and then hand it over to Luke and Annika. Next slide. So before we dive deeper, allow me to explain Tier 2. Emily did a great job. Pretty much a Tier 2 building is a building where the sum of multifamily, residential, non-residential, hotel, motel, and dormitory floor areas exceed 20,000 gross square feet, but does not exceed 50,000 gross square feet, excluding parking garage. So as Emily said, Tier 2 buildings include multifamily residential greater than 20,000 and those greater than 50,000, excluding parking garage. Next slide, please. So when the proposed rules are finalized, there will eventually be an amendment to the existing WAC 19450, as you can see to the left. The existing WAC currently only addresses Tier 1. The WAC 19450 are amendments that Commerce developed to ASHRAE Standard 100 to conform to the Clean Buildings legislation. Together, the WAC and Standard 100 become the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. You will not automatically see the updates to the integrated document this year when you download it. We plan on partnering with ASHRAE again and try to publish an integrated document to include the updated amendments. More to come. Next slide, please. So this is a breakdown of the Clean Buildings Performance Standard by section. This is, in this current rulemaking, we're making edits to these sections. And as you can see, adding a new section, Annex Y, which is specific to Tier 2 covered buildings. Next slide. Thank you. Many of you may be wondering about building owner notification. So right now, we need to finalize the strategy and process of identifying Tier 2 buildings and building owners. After identifying the Tier 2 buildings, we will incorporate them into the Clean Buildings portal. And by July 1st, 2025, Commerce must provide Tier 2 building owners with notification of the requirements. Now, Luke is going to do a deeper dive into Tier 2. Next slide.
Thank you, Annalyn. So let's start with exemptions. Exemptions proposed for Tier 2 buildings are similar to those for Tier 1 buildings, based on buildings between 20,000, 50,000 square feet. So, however, the exemption application timeline is different for Tier 2 buildings. The Tier 2 buildings may apply for exemption no sooner than July 1st, 2025. So that's 2 years prior to the Tier 2 compliance date of July 1st of 2027. That's opposed to the 3-year window allowed for Tier 1 buildings. So exemptions, like Tier 1, exemptions are valid for a 5-year cycle and must be reapplied for each cycle thereafter when applicable. So exemptions are available for covered buildings, for all covered buildings, less than 50,000 square feet of condition, with less than 50,000 square feet of conditioned floor area that's occupied, less than 20,000 square feet of conditioned space, more than 50% of floor area designated as factory group F or high hazard group H by the building codes. If the building is an agricultural structure, if it's pending demolition, or there are several financial hardship exemptions as well. So you'll find those in Annex Y of the proposed Tier 2 rules. Next slide, please. As Emily has mentioned previously, Tier 2 covered buildings requirements include benchmarking, as well as implementation of an energy management plan and an operations and maintenance program in accordance with the standard. Again, there is no building performance metric required for Tier 2 buildings at this time. Next slide, please. So here's a list of new terms and definitions and proposed amendments to look for in the definitions when reviewing the Tier 2 and Tier 1 draft language. The draft language document was emailed to registrants and will be available on the Clean Buildings website next week. So within the draft language, there are track changes, shows proposed additions with underlines and proposed deletions with strike throughs. Comments identify the source reference. So whether they're legislative amendments via Senate Bill 5722 or Commerce amendments. I will show you all this document towards the end of this presentation so you can get familiar with the what the draft language looks like and how it's formatted. Many of you who've participated in workshops previously are probably familiar with this. So let's go over a few of these terms here. I'm just going to walk through here, take some time to look at these terms and kind of give you a little information about it. So benchmarking is a new term developed by Commerce to explain Section 5.2 building energy monitoring. It's just clarifying information. Building owners amended by the legislation in 5722. Adding the second sentence addressing land leases. More detail again, clarifying language. Building tenant is a new term defined by the legislature in Senate Bill 5722. With conditional compliance, we have added detail to address the application to Tier 2 buildings. I will speak more to Tier 2 conditional compliance in a few slides when we review the Tier 2 flow chart. Connected buildings, it's a new term developed by Commerce to account for buildings with shared meters. Again, more to come on this term as well further on in the program. Contiguous property, it's a new term developed by Commerce to define the boundary of the building with sole building ownership. I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Covered building, it's amendment by the legislature in 5722 to clarify the addition of Tier 2 buildings. Director is a new term defined by the 5722. Energy use intensity target was amended by 5722. The lighting schedule was amended by Commerce. We deleted the term lamps for clarity and ease of compliance with the lighting schedule. Multifamily residential building is a new term defined by 5722. Commerce had proposed an amendment to the definition of multifamily residential building that the 5722 had defined. We proposed that in a previous workshop, and we have since deleted that proposal based on comments. We have identified any amendment to previous proposals within the draft language document with highlighted comments. And I will show you that when we take a look at that document later. Net energy use was amended by 5722 to clarify application of renewable energy production to the EY calculation. Physical occupancy is a new term developed by Commerce to define conditions addressed in one of the exemptions and to clarify differences between empty and vacant buildings. So for an example, a space can be empty on any given day due to remote working and the like. It is still considered to have physical occupancy, however, and is still occupied in respect to the building occupancy exemption. So space which is not leased to a tenant does not have physical occupancy and is considered unoccupied. So take a look at that physical occupancy definition within the draft language and how it relates to the exemptions. Qualified energy manager is a new term developed by Commerce to define a less intensive level of credentials required for Tier 2 compliance work. The Tier 1 requires a qualified person, which is a little more intensive credentials. Tier 1 covered buildings is defined by 5722 and amended in these rules, as well as Tier 2. And lastly, the weather normalized energy use intensity definition was amended by Commerce for consistency with the standard. So it was weather normalized energy utilization index, which is synonymous with weather normalized energy use intensity. We amended it to be consistent with the use of that term elsewhere in the rules. And hand the slides over to Judy now for new term and definition. Judy, did you want to do that, or did you want me to do that one?
I wanted you to do that one, Luke.
Okay, I got it then. So one of the new terms that we wanted to go into a little more detail with is the term connected buildings. So the definition is a collection of buildings owned by the same building owner that are situated on the same or adjacent parcels and have shared energy meters. So this allows for compliance for tier 2. It's if a tier 2 building is sharing a meter with other buildings, such as in this example here. So we have two tier 2 buildings, a 24,000 square foot building and a 25,000 square foot building. They share meters together as well as with a 15,000 square foot building. So for tier 2, benchmarking would require the creation of an EUI and an EUI target, or any energy use intensity for the building, as well as the energy use intensity target for the building. Since it shares the meter with other buildings, the requirement would be that a tier 2 building benchmark or create the EUI at the connected building level. So all buildings connected to that meter, regardless of whether they're tier 1, tier 2, or not even covered by the standard. And the target would also be developed at that level. That's for reporting of benchmarking requirements for tier 2 buildings. This term is also proposed to be used in application to tier 1 buildings in lieu of having to submeter out a tier 1 building in order to comply through the EUI target compliance method. So just imagine these 24 and 25K buildings being greater than 50,000 square feet. This would allow benchmarking and compliance through the EUI target at that connected building level, so an aggregate level of all connected buildings. We'll talk more about this later on in the program today. Next slide, please. Okay, so a couple definitions I wanted to draw out a little bit further. So the building owner is ultimately responsible for compliance and is the person or entity holding title to the building. And the building owner shall designate a qualified energy manager. Again, this is for tier 2. The building owner shall designate a qualified energy manager who meets the minimum qualifications outlined in this definition. So an individual designated by the building owner who has 3 years of experience, including educational and or professional experience with commercial building operations and or building energy management. In addition to successful completion of Clean Buildings Tier 2 training program as specified by the AHJ, and the AHJ being Commerce. So the Commerce will be developing this specified training to certify an individual that has the required experience level as the qualified energy manager. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as stated, the proposed rules require a qualified energy manager, and the responsibilities of the qualified energy manager are to determine, there's the benchmark, number 1. So that's determining whether or not the building seeking compliance has an energy use intensity target in accordance with Section 7, and establish the energy use intensity of the EUI in accordance with Section 5 of the standard. And lastly, the qualified energy manager is to submit compliance forms as specified in Normative Annex Y. So Normative Annex Y is the new section of the standard that covers Tier 2 compliance documentation requirements. So keep in mind, as noted already, if the covered building is connected by energy meters to other buildings, for Tier 2, the energy use intensity and the energy use intensity target shall be developed at that connected building level. So the qualified energy manager is not required to develop the energy management program and the energy management plan and the operations and maintenance program, but they are required to attest in writing on Form A that the EMP, Energy Management Plan, and the O&M program, Operations and Maintenance Program, have been developed and implemented in accordance with the standard by the compliance state. So the building owner can designate whoever they want to develop those programs. It is the qualified energy manager that has to attest that they have been successfully developed and implemented by the compliance state. So the Tier 1 requirements require the EMP and the O&M to be implemented a year prior to the compliance date. For Tier 2, they're only required to be implemented by the compliance date. Next slide. This slide kind of represents a little more detail of what the energy management plan and operations and maintenance program requirements are. Essentially, they're the same as they are for Tier 2. There's a couple exceptions in there. Please focus on Section 5 and Section 6, as well as Annex L of the standard for the specifics of the energy management plan and the operations and maintenance program. But essentially, the energy management plan is going to include building energy metering and reporting, the energy use intensity reporting, energy efficiency measure implementation. So again, Tier 2 is not a building performance requirement. There are no requirements to install energy efficiency measures for Tier 2. However, the energy management plan does require recording of any energy efficiency measure that the building owner implements on their own accord. Operations and maintenance considerations for energy managers. Communication responsibilities are all outlined in energy management plan. So the operations and maintenance program is a living document used to ensure energy efficient operation and to minimize failure in building systems and components throughout their service life. So this document is outlined again in Section 6 and normative Annex L. There are some informative annex and references to other ASHRAE standards in the development of the operations and maintenance program, but the requirements are in Section 6 and normative Annex L. And it is a component of the energy management plan. So it lists inspection and maintenance requirements for specified systems and equipment and establishes those responsibilities for individuals operating and maintaining this equipment. Next slide, please. So there's a lot to take in, but I wanted to ensure folks that there will be support for Tier 2 building owners seeking compliance with the standard. So Senate Bill 5722 includes language for enhanced technical support, which we covered in the previous workshop in May. If you attended that, I want to reiterate that the Tier 2 buildings Congress is tasked with developing and providing enhanced technical support focuses on benchmarking building energy use and assisting in the development of energy management plans and operations and maintenance programs for Tier 2 buildings whose owners typically do not employ dedicated building managers. So this includes, but it's not limited to, multifamily housing, childcare facilities, and houses of worship. So we are tasked with prioritizing this enhanced technical assistance to under-resourced buildings with high energy use, buildings in rural communities, buildings whose tenants are primarily small businesses, and buildings located in high-risk communities, according to the Department of Health's Environmental Health Disparities Map. So we are currently developing partnerships and actively working to create templates and other guidance tools for the EMP and the O&M program development. These are for covered building owners to use for compliance with the standard. We appreciate all of the suggestions for enhanced technical support submitted via public comment, and please keep those rolling in if you have some great ideas. Next slide, please. All right, here we got a little bit of a flow chart kind of representing how to avoid penalties in compliance with Tier 2 buildings. So penalties for noncompliance may be assessed at 30 cents per square foot floor area. To avoid penalty, building owners shall either pursue compliance with the benchmarking, EMP and O&M requirements of the standard, receive an exemption in accordance with the standard, receive conditional compliance in accordance with the standard. Conditional compliance for Tier 2 buildings requires an application which includes submittal of benchmarking. Conditional compliance grants building owners 180 days beyond the approval date to complete the EMP and O&M requirements of the standard. So lastly, in order to avoid penalty, there could be a successful process through a hearing contending the application of the standard to their building. Next slide, please.
That's me.
All right. Thank you,
Let's
Annika.
talk about the Tier 2 incentive program. A Tier 2 building that demonstrates compliance with benchmarking, energy management, and operations and maintenance plan requirements may receive an incentive payment of 30 cents per gross square foot of floor area, and this excludes parking, unconditioned or semi-conditioned spaces. Commerce may also implement a tiered incentive structure for upgrading multifamily buildings, where building owners provide a commitment to anti-displacement provisions. This program begins July 1st, 2025, and the application period ends June 1st, 2030. So after the Tier 2 rulemaking concludes, the Clean Buildings team will launch a workshop series to develop the guidelines for this incentive program. To receive notifications about the Tier 2 incentive program workshops, please use the link in the chat to sign up. We will be finalizing the guidelines before the incentive program launches July 1st, 2025.
Okay, let's take a break. 5 minutes.
What time do you want us back on?
It is 10:37. Let's go with 10:40. Let's make it a 10:45. Give it a little bit more than 5 minutes. Okay, back from break. We'll answer some questions that we received in the chat and the question box. Let's see. Luke, are you on the line?
I am.
Okay, here's the first question. I believe it's regarding the connected buildings. So how many buildings can we add to 1 meter?
So the intent of the proposal for the connected buildings is to include all buildings connected to a single meter. So it's basically going to be the most disaggregated level one could create an EUI for a group of buildings. So if you have 1 or 2 meters serving 4 buildings, maybe of those 4 buildings, the electric meter serves 3 of them. And the 4th has its own independent electric meter, but all of those 4 buildings are served by the same gas meter. So that means that in order to create an EUI for that group of 4 buildings, the most disaggregated level would be 4. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, Thanks, Luke. So the next one is regarding, I believe, the qualified energy manager. When the question is, when will the energy manager training be done? Will it be done through Commerce? Patrick has BOC 1 and 2 certs and is currently a qualified person for the rules for the organization. So would he qualify as a energy manager as well?
The intent of the qualified energy manager training, it's likely to be done by Commerce, but it would be created by Commerce. And I'm not sure exactly when we'll release that, but we'll certainly have that training available prior to, well, sometime probably in 2024. The qualified person, if you have a higher credential, that would suffice in lieu of taking the qualified energy manager training for Tier 2. So we should probably think about how we can finesse that kind of language into the definition of qualified energy manager.
I agree. Patrick, you make a good point. If you can, please submit that suggestion through the comment form. You'll see the link in the chat, just so that we don't forget it as we develop these draft rules. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks. Next question regarding data centers in Tier 1 are listed as not having an energy target. Will Tier 2 data centers be required to benchmark and create energy management plans and operation maintenance programs still?
Yes, thanks for the question. That's a good one. So yes, buildings without a target can still be covered buildings. So if you can't create a target, and there is language in the proposed rules, draft rules, that state that if you cannot create a target for any specific building, such as a building with a data center in it, then you just you will be reporting the target as the median site EUI that is established within your portfolio manager account. So as you build the portfolio manager account to develop the EUI for the building, that account automatically creates a site median EUI for the building based on the building property types or building activity types that are input into your portfolio manager account. Form C is one of the required forms for submitting documentation of your EUI, and Form C is essentially a synopsis of your Energy Star portfolio manager account, and it will automatically include that national median site EUI. So that is used in lieu of targets developed in accordance with Section 7 of our standard.
Great. Thanks, Lee. Ready for the next one?
Sure.
How does a condo operate under these guidelines? The new definition of qualified energy manager says it has to be a person designated by the building owner, and there's no such person for a residential condo that has been fully occupied. Here is the and then they write the definition of qualified energy manager.
Mm-hmm. So a building owner could be the individual or the entity.
There's no entity for a condo. All you've got is an association.
A homeowners
but it doesn't own. Yeah,
right.
But it doesn't own the building. It needs to be a broader definition.
Right. So as the standard is, as the rules are proposed, condos aren't individual dwelling units, and condos aren't necessarily required to comply with the Tier 2 requirements. The standard applies to buildings and building complexes. The building complex is defined as a building or group of buildings interconnected through conditioned space on contiguous property. And contiguous property is defined as adjacent properties of sole ownership.
Yeah, but it isn't sole ownership. That's what I'm trying to say. You know, I mean, like, we're a high-rise condo, and if the rule needs to be changed a little bit so that you can include a condo, if the condo wants to select a QEM, they can't do it because it's not a sole owner. And you can't have a manager appoint a QEM either. They've just got to tweak some language in here so that when condos start applying, somebody's not going to say, well, sorry, you don't fit under any of the definitions.
So if a condo has communal property, such as corridors, lobbies, and such.
Well, that's what's controlled by the association.
Right.
It
So
isn't
the association is the entity that holds title to
No, they don't.
those areas.
Well, they have, I mean, not the building. They have those areas.
Right.
This is a
And
very
what
simple change to make if somebody understands the fact that they're not a sole owner.
right. So what I'm saying is that as the rules are written and proposed at this point, the individual owners of dwelling units in the condo would not necessarily be required to comply with Tier 2 unless their unit, their own ownership, individual ownership is over 20,000 square feet.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if a condo building wants to qualify and they need to submit for incentives and so on, who is qualified to actually sign off on that, to appoint a QEM or anybody else? The rules aren't quite broad enough to encompass that. If you have a lawyer there, maybe somebody should submit to the lawyer so that they can clarify this easily.
Yeah, when it comes to application of the early adopter incentive, we're going to be developing those rules here in the future. We haven't started that yet. So this is great information for us to consider when we develop those rules.
Well, I'm talking about Tier 1 because this is a large building, over
The tier-
200,000 square
Yeah.
feet.
The Tier 1 requirements do not apply to multifamily building, including condos.
I thought that.
For the rules are not required for multifamily or condos, but multifamily and condos, including condos, can participate in Tier 1 requirements.
Right.
For
What I'm saying is, how do we go about if we want to do an early adopter incentive? How do we legally do that when, if you look and read the rules separately and carefully, it really doesn't provide for it if you're a condo? And I think they could be easily changed to just allow that so that we can apply if we want to.
Right, and that would be handled through our early adopter incentive guidelines outside of the rules, but we can account for that.
You cannot account for that in these rules. I don't understand.
Let me interject, Steve. I think I've got the issue that you are framing, and we'll take a look at it and look at the language. Be specific about the building owner and how that applies to a condo entity that would want to.
Well, I wrote a long
comment.
question about this 3 weeks ago, and nobody responded to me whatsoever. And I'm just trying to get this clarified, and I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to submit to you again, since I didn't seem to be able to submit to you before in a way that anybody could read it and respond to me.
Right,
Yeah.
and just FYI, we don't respond to the comments, so we receive your comments and read them. We'll work to get that language more specific, as I understand your issue today with the entity versus the association and who the actual legal owner is.
Right, I mean,
Yes,
so now I
understand.
have to do something more than what I've just done here, asking the question, and more than what I did earlier in asking a
No.
question for public comment. How do I
No,
do?
no, you don't need to do more.
Steve,
Okay.
I'll
I'm
put my
trying to
email
confirm.
address. I'll put my email and the address in the chat, and we can schedule a meeting to go over your building and the details of it, and we can see what we can do and how the incentive program could apply.
Okay, so now you're going to put your email address where?
In the chat.
In
That's
the-
Annika, the incentive program manager, Steve.
Annika.
Mhm.
Annika
Yeah.
McDonald.
Yes, that's me. I will. I'll put my email in the chat, and if you can send me an email, and then I'll have your, or if you want to put your email address in the chat, I can schedule a meeting for us to go over the incentive program
Okay,
together.
I did this in the Q&A, so you want me to go over to chat and then,
No, that's okay. We can gather it from the Q&A. As long as your contact information is there, then I can gather that, and then I will reach
I'll
out.
put it in and
But-
just, I'll put it in a separate one here.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks so much.
Okay, and I just want to clarify, I would like to clarify a quick point just so everybody's clear. If building owners or anybody in the industry is submitting questions to the Commerce team through our customer support channels, we absolutely follow up, answer those questions. We're happy to schedule time, answer those via email. Comments that are submitted through this rulemaking process, we're not responding to. We're gathering those up, and then they're summarized in the concise explanatory statement that is included in our CR filing. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I'm going to suggest we go ahead and move on so we can get through the rest of our content today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Emily. Let's just take one more question, and then we'll move on to the next topic, which would be Tier 1 buildings and their updates. Ready, Luke, for the next one?
Sure.
So connected buildings question. So 3 buildings share a meter. 2 are over 50,000 square feet. 1 is under 20,000 and is industrial. How is an EUI calculated when one building doesn't have to comply and doesn't have an EUIT data available in the calculator?
Right, so in the specific scenario, you would not be able to use the connected building level to comply with the Tier 1 standard. First of all, as you know, industrial factory group F or high hazard group H buildings do not have a target. So you could not create a target for it. So thus creating an EUI would not help you meet a target. So those 2 individual Tier 1 buildings over 50,000 square feet would need to, again, the connected buildings level for Tier 1 is an alternative compliance path. It's not a requirement. It's introduced to allow more flexibility so that building owners don't necessarily have to sub-meter in order to pursue the EUIT path at the connected building level. There may be other extenuating circumstances that make that pathway not available, such as the example here, where you're also connected to an industrial complex. One thing you could do is instead of sub-metering the 2 individual buildings, you sub-meter the industrial building out. If it truly is a individual building, you could do that and then comply with the 2 under the connected buildings with the 2 Tier 1 buildings at the connected building level. So those 2 50,000 plus square foot covered buildings. You would just need to isolate out that industrial in order to pursue the EUIT path.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.
Great, thank you for the question. Okay, let's move on. Judy, are you ready?
Sure.
Okay, next slide, please.
Hi, my name is Judy Darst. I'm a technical specialist with Clean Buildings. I'm going to present a brief recap of Tier 1. Next slide. The Clean Buildings Law, House Bill 1257, was authorized in the 2019 legislative session. As Annalyn reviewed earlier, the Clean Building Performance Standard is based on ASHRAE Standard 100, which covers energy efficiency in existing buildings. This is the reference standard. In WAC 19450, Commerce developed amendments to the Standard 100 to conform with the Clean Buildings legislation. So the integrated document developed by ASHRAE that incorporates all state amendments into the Standard 100 can be downloaded through our Clean Buildings website, and we'll post the link in the chat. This law charged Commerce with rulemaking, notifying building owners, administrating incentives, and supporting mandatory compliance. Next slide. The standard applies to existing covered buildings. This will include both Tier 1 and Tier 2. The standard defines a Tier 1 covered building as a building where the sum of the non-residential, hotel, motel, and dormitory floor areas exceeds 50,000 gross square feet, excluding the parking garage. A building complex is defined with the Clean Buildings Performance Standard as a group of buildings interconnected by conditioned space on contiguous property. Next slide. So the Tier 1 requirements, the basic requirements of the standard, are similar to Tier 2 as Luke reviewed earlier. Tier 1 requires benchmarking, the implementation of the operations and maintenance program, and the energy management plan. Where Tier 1 differs from Tier 2 is that Tier 1 also requires compliance with an energy performance metric, either by meeting the energy use intensity target, EUIT, or pursuing the investment criteria compliance path, which requires an energy audit and implementation of cost-effective energy efficiency measures. Annika will now present on Tier 1 incentive program. Annika.
Thanks, Judy. This is Annika McDonald. So the Tier 1 incentive program. The purpose of this program is to encourage early adoption of the Tier 1 Clean Buildings Performance Standard by meeting your building's energy use intensity target before mandatory compliance deadlines that begin June 1st, 2026. So one of the qualifications for this program is the building must be over 50,000 square feet, and it must be able to measure its energy use intensity. The legislature authorized $75 million for this program. The incentive is 85 cents per square foot of gross floor area, excluding parking, unconditioned or semi-conditioned spaces. The incentive is paid to building owners by utility service providers who provide energy services to the building and participating in the incentive program. The window for applying to the program ends 1 year before mandatory compliance deadlines. This incentive can also be administered in addition to utility conservation incentives, rebates, energy grants, or efficiency financing. Please visit the Clean Buildings Incentive Program webpage to review the guidebook for application details.
Thanks, Annika. During the Senate Bill 5722 rulemaking to add Tier 2 to the standard, we found a few reasons to propose amendments to Tier 1. Next slide. Those reasons and categories are listed here. We are proposing some changes to clean up grammatical and formatting errors, add clarity to the existing language, amend Tier 1 rules to align with the Senate Bill 5722 Tier 2 requirements, and provide compliance alternatives and options. In the next few slides, I'm going to show some examples and review a few of the Tier 1 amendments. Next slide. So the emergency rule updates, including changes to exemptions. Commerce filed an emergency rule change effective February 15, 2023. The emergency rule states that applications for exemptions may be submitted to Commerce no sooner than 3 years prior to the compliance date and no later than 180 days prior to the compliance date. If the building meets one of the exemption criteria in RCW 1927A 210, Section 7C, Building owners can now apply for an exemption 3 years prior to the scheduled compliance date. So that means Tier 1 buildings over 220,000 square feet can apply for an exemption beginning on June 1st, 2023. Tier 1 buildings over 90 square feet can apply for an exemption beginning on June 1st, 2024. And Tier 1 buildings over 50,000 square feet can apply for exemption beginning on June 1, 2025. Within 6 months or 180 days before the mandatory compliance date, building owners who have received an exemption approval must certify that the building still meets the eligibility qualifications for the exemption and that there have been no material changes to the qualifying conditions. Commerce will provide a one-page declaration for exempted building owners to sign. Next slide. So corrections, formatting and title and grammar type changes. Here's a sample screenshot showing the addition of titles, which can help navigate through the standard. Correcting language like the rewording of number 1 here, and cleaning up inconsistencies like Luke mentioned before. For instance, in some places the WNEUI was written weather normalized energy utilization index. We corrected them to be consistent with EUI energy use intensity. So now they read weather normalized energy use intensity. Next slide. So here is the list of new terms and definitions with proposed changes. It is basically the same list we showed in the Tier 2 section of this presentation. The definitions section of the standard applies to both Tier 1 and Tier 2 buildings. When editing existing terms or creating new terms, we needed to consider both Tier 1 and Tier 2 implications. If a definition is specific to either Tier 1 or Tier 2, it will state it explicitly. For example, the Tier 1 covered buildings, Tier 2 covered buildings are specific. Also, the terms multifamily residential building and qualified energy manager are both Tier 2 specific terms and not listed here on this Tier 1 slide. For all the defined terms, please see the draft language, and I'm sure there's links in the chat, and it was emailed to participants. So next slide. Looking at a couple examples of Tier 1 versus Tier 2, there's prefacing specific sections for Tier 1 covered buildings or for Tier 2 covered buildings. Previously, the standard only applied to Tier 1. So now some section preferences will clarify if the requirements apply to Tier 1, Tier 2, or both. Connected buildings. As Luke reviewed earlier, the connected building concept was introduced to address benchmarking for Tier 2 buildings with a shared meter. For consistency and to provide an alternative compliance pathway, we are proposing applying the connected building concept to Tier 1 covered buildings and mixed use buildings too. Later in this webinar, Luke will review some sample configurations to explore this concept some more. Next slide. Reporting requirements. Tier 1 reporting requirements will continue to be specified in Annex Z of the standard. We introduced the Annex Y for Tier 2 reporting requirements. And then Tier 2 exceptions. In some instances, we added exceptions to Tier 1 requirements for Tier 2 covered buildings. For example, Tier 2 buildings can use a qualified energy manager and are accepted from the qualified person requirement. There's a good question earlier about if you're a qualified person and you suffice as qualified energy manager. Also, if Tier 2 buildings are accepted from the energy management plan requirements for lighting schedule and survey, these are sections 5.1.2, 12, and 13. So it's listed as a Tier 2 exception. Next slide. Measurement and verification. We are proposing to add a measurement and verification subsection for buildings with the building energy monitoring. This is section 4.3.3.3. It is modeled after the measurement and verification section for buildings without building energy monitoring, or section 4.3.3.4, as you can see here on the slide. Energy audit, we're proposing to extend the time an energy audit is viable and may be used for the Clean Building Performance Standard compliance from 3 years to 5 years. This is in section 8.2.1. This time frame will align with the ongoing compliance schedule. Next slide. So this is talking about changes and amendments to Annex Z. The requirements of Annex Z were reviewed to add clarity and to provide additional compliance flexibility. Commerce found to be specific pain points for stakeholders. These proposals are intended to allow for greater compliance flexibility while still maintaining the intended energy savings associated with existing rules. So this, I'm just going to quickly go through this list. General compliance is section Z 3.1, and it clarifies that the investment criteria is an available compliance pathway. The phased implementation for EUIT through conditional compliance is section Z.4.41. I said that wrong. Z4.41. Okay, I'm just going to leave it. Added this section to address phased implementation for EUIT through conditional compliance. This section is modeled after the existing section Z4.5.1, phased implementation for investment criteria through conditional compliance. There's additional data points to Form A, and this is section Z.6.1. In subsection 6, the summary data, the additional data points address conditional compliance EUIT, baseline and projected EUIT, or baseline and projected EUI, excuse me. Conditional compliance investment criteria is also asking for baseline and projected KBQ and the projected savings. The connected buildings alternate path in section Z6.3 exception. This is adding connected buildings to the exception for EUI calculation reporting on portfolio manager to allow this compliance on a connected building level. And then limited campus level compliance alternative for K-12 college, universities, hospitals, and prisons is in table 7.2a in footnote 9. Building activity type definitions, probably the biggest change is an added new table 7.4, and there's more detail in the next slide. And then other miscellaneous edits. Next slide. So in table 7.4 was developed to provide clarity for the qualified person or qualified energy manager responsible to develop the EUIT in accordance with Clean Buildings Performance Standard. Table 7.4 defines each building activity type found in table 7.1. Consistent with ASHRAE Standard 100, these definitions were developed based on Energy Star Portfolio Manager definitions. Additionally, table 7.4 includes definitions for data center and urgent care building activity types defined in the existing rules, WAC 19450, as well as building activity types listed in table 7.1 not defined in ESPM. And then here's a screenshot just of a sample of the table. Next slide. So how do you provide feedback and comments? Please review the draft language. It is available on the Clean Buildings homepage, and it was emailed to registrants this morning. Submit comments using the public comment form. We do read all comments and account for them. We'll post a link in the chat. Write your comment either in the field provided or you can attach documents. And then submit your comments by September 29, 2023. Now, Luke is going to lead a discussion and review Tier 1 and Tier 2 building configuration examples. Thank you. Luke.
All right, thank you, Judy, and thanks for covering those specific change in section numbers for the proposed amendments to Tier 1. So attendees of the workshop here, you will get a copy of this presentation that can be used as reference to some of these section numbers. I'm going to kind of go over a few slides here to talk about some of the specifics in what Judy discussed. Some of it we've already discussed today. We've had some great dialogue regarding these new amendments and existing rules. Let's continue that through these next few slides, and then we'll actually go into a formal Q&A. But I wanted to kind of cover some of these highlighted changes that are to Tier 1 and Tier 2 that are fairly significant. Next slide, please. All right. So I want to cover these definitions and scenarios, and you know, like I said, I want to invite questions from attendees and some discussion around these to provide more clarity. So again, Section 3 of the standard is definitions. We have made amendments and additions based on 5722, as well as Commerce proposals to add clarity. A lot of these proposals were initiated by dialogue with stakeholders and items they found would be useful in helping improve the standard itself. So covered buildings includes Tier 1 covered buildings and Tier 2 covered buildings. Again, in the current rules, so WAC 19450 that we developed a couple of years ago, we referred to the clean building standards to apply to covered commercial buildings. With the introduction of Senate Bill 5722, we expanded the law to cover smaller buildings, and they decided to address those with differently. So the Tier 1 or the 50,000 square feet and above, Tier 2 is 20 to 50,000 square feet. So again, there's going to be an amended definition for covered buildings in the standard. Connected buildings was, again, the proposal that Commerce submitted in order to provide an alternate pathway for compliance under the energy use intensity target pathway for Tier 1. And for any connected building, Tier 2 connected buildings, that is how the rules will require benchmarking for Tier 2 buildings. So it's a collection of buildings owned by the same building owner that are situated on the same or adjacent parcels, and they have shared energy meters. Next is the definition complex. Definition complex is currently in the rules, so 194-50, part of the integrated standard, and applies to Tier 1 buildings and Tier 2 buildings, but it's a group of buildings interconnected by conditioned spaces on contiguous property. Congress has introduced a definition for contiguous property. That's adjoining property under sole ownership. So a property cannot be considered contiguous if it has separate ownership. So lastly, Judy touched base on this. This is the campus level compliance. This is new. It's an alternative for Tier 1 compliance or Tier 2. Campus level means that the EUIT is for a collection of all buildings with a single shared primary function that act as a single property. So we have identified 4 different building activity types within the standard, within Table 7-1, that this applies to. That would be K through 12 education, so whether it's high school, middle school, or elementary. College universities, prisons, and hospitals. So these are building activity types that the source data we use to develop the energy use intensity targets were based on that campus level. So in order to compare a EUI of a building on a of a campus, you would need to compare that to the target that was developed at a campus level. So we've identified those 4 building activity types as targets that were based, the source data was based at the campus level. So that means that a campus or a K-12 campus, for example, can comply with the standard at that campus level. So all buildings with a single shared primary function that act as a single property that can comply at that level, whether they're connected by shared meters or not. Next slide, please. Okay, requirements before versus alternative paths. We kind of touched on this before. Tier 4, Tier 1 buildings. Tier 1 building, again, is a building over 50,000 square feet minus the parking garage area. That could be commercial, hotel, motel, or dormitories. Does not include multifamily or condos as a requirement. Multifamily requirements can take advantage of the Tier 1 early adopter incentive program in a voluntary basis. They would need to meet all the Tier 1 requirements in order to take advantage of that early adopter incentive program. There are other eligibility requirements for the early adopter incentive program, including the building needs to be 15 EUI or higher over the target. And again, the building complex is identified in the standard to further define what a building is. And a building can be, under this definition, or is under this definition, a series of buildings interconnected through conditioned space on contiguous property. And again, contiguous property is adjacent property of sole ownership. We have introduced alternative pathways for Tier 1 buildings. These are not requirements, but you can, as a Tier 1 building, comply at the connected building level if such if the buildings are set up to do so. Like the example in the question we answered earlier about the 2 Tier 1 buildings connected through a shared meter with an industrial building, they would not be able to comply through EUIT unless they did some submetering to isolate out that industrial building that does not have a target and therefore cannot pursue compliance through the EUIT pathway. And again, the campus level compliance is an alternate, it's not a requirement. So if you have a K-12 school, hospital, college, university, prison, you're not required to comply at the campus level, but the new proposal opens up the opportunity to do so where applicable. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example, visual example of the campus compliance. As the proposal reads, and again, this is outlined in table 7-2A of the standard, and I believe it's in 7-1 as well. For those 4 building activity types, and this is noted as a footnote to those tables, compliance compliance alternate would be at the campus level. So in this example, we have 3 Tier 1 buildings, 100K, 50K, 50K, 1 Tier 2 building, which is 20K, and 1 building that's 1,000 square feet. If they meet the building activity definitions for K-12 higher ed, prisons, or hospitals, and they would be allowed to comply through the EUIT path at the campus level. That means you would aggregate the total square footage of all these buildings on the campus and aggregate the energy use of all the buildings. and create your EUI that way. The energy use intensity target would be based on table 7-2 for the entirety or the aggregate of the campus buildings. Again, this was developed in order to respond to the fact that the targets in table 7-2A were developed at that campus level for those building activity types. The compliance date as proposed would be based on the largest of the covered buildings on that campus. So in this example, the largest building is 100,000 square feet. So the compliance date would be June 1st, 2027. The energy management plan and operations and maintenance program requirements of the standard would only apply to the tier 1 and tier 2 buildings. Although best practice is obviously to include the entire campus in those energy management plans and operations and maintenance programs. If you do have any comments regarding this campus level compliance, we can discuss that now. I do encourage you to submit a formal comment. And if you have specific questions that you would want us to respond to, I suggest you send a question to our hotline email or phone line.
Look, we have some questions about connected buildings
Right.
and campus. You might have asked this already. Can you clarify how the connected building concept interfaces with compliance as a campus? I think you answered that already.
Yeah, well, you would kind of do either or, right? If you have a group of connected buildings on a K-12 campus, you could comply at that connected building level, or you could comply at the campus level, or you could comply at the individual building level.
So can a campus include multiple ownership of buildings that make up the campus?
As the standard is written, it would have to be of sole ownership. That's a good question. We'll put a little more thought into that. If you would like us to respond directly to you regarding that, I suggest you send in a formal question to our hotline.
There's a question about the technical guidance for K-12 campus based on the proposed definitions of connected building. Will there be any changes to that?
We might update that compliance guidance for K-12 based on these proposals. Again, these proposals were based on stakeholder engagement in ways that we can improve the standard to not only make compliance more cost effective, but still meet the intent of the legislation in meeting our energy conservation goals for the state.
Okay, and one more about connected buildings. Does the hours of the largest building determine the operating shift normalization factor? Table 7-3.
Yeah, if you have multiple shift normalization factors, you can do an area weighted calculation for that. So for example, if you have a K-12 school with various buildings, you can disaggregate out certain buildings that may have a different shift operation normalization factor. You can apply that to higher ed, prisons, hospitals as well. That would be done in the EYT calculation, which formally is going to be done on our Clean Buildings portal. Form B is what it's known as, or building details.
For a campus level compliance, can you have one energy management plan that links per building O&Ms?
Yes. So part of where this campus level campus level compliance pathway justification comes from is the introduction of Senate Bill 1390, this previous legislation session, that requires state buildings connected to a district heating and or cooling system create a decarbonization plan. And it also allows for those buildings to comply with clean building standards through that decarbonization plan. Privately held buildings connected to a district heating and or cooling system can voluntarily comply through this decarbonization plan. Those rules have not been developed yet. Those will take place after Tier 2 rulemaking. But the legislation allows the energy management plan to be implemented at the campus level. So for buildings that are not complying through the 1390 decarbonization plan, but are complying through the campus level compliant, we can apply the energy management plan at the campus level. That energy management plan just needs to account for every building within that campus.
Thanks, Luke. I'll let you move on and we'll go back to questions a little later.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. All right, so just a kind of graphic representation of a few scenarios here. So we got a, let's say it's a vertical building. We've got multi-use. We've got residential multifamily on the 2nd through 5th floor. Various units that they must be luxury penthouses because they're 10 units at 100,000 square feet. So those are some pretty nice condos. We also have on the 1st floor 15,000 square feet of commercial. So scenario 1 would be this entire building envelope is same owner. And there may be interconnected through conditioned space. This scenario, the building would need to comply as a whole building with Tier 2 requirements. Again, Tier 2 requires buildings 20,000 to 50,000 square feet and all multifamily over 20,000 square feet to comply with the standard. So since it's interconnected through conditioned space, this residential area and the commercial area is one building complex as defined by the standard. So this building would need to meet Tier 2 requirements in scenario 1, which is the benchmarking and the application of the energy management plan and the operations and maintenance program in accordance with the standard. Okay, scenario 2, same owner, but the building's not connected through conditioned space. The residential portion of the building, so this would not necessarily be a Tier 2 building. So the residential portion, since it's not interconnected through conditioned space, would be Tier 2 compliance. And the commercial floor under 15,000 square foot would not be subject to compliance. Now, it is likely that this scenario would not exist much because generally in this configuration of the tower, the buildings are interconnected through conditioned space via a lobby and elevator shafts, stairwells, so on. But if that scenario 2 exists, that's how it would be separated. Scenario 3 would be separate ownership. So the commercial is owned by one entity or individual owner, the residential owned by another. Even if they are interconnected through conditioned space, they are not of sole ownership. So the residential would need to comply since it's over 20,000 square feet on its own, but the commercial would not be subject because it is under 20,000 square feet on its own of sole ownership.
Luke, we have a question regarding non-conditioned spaces.
Okay,
Would you like to take it?
sure.
Can you briefly go over the rules of exemption for non-conditioned spaces again? And how the timing applies for example, a 60,000 square foot building with 30,000 square foot of conditioned space, tier 1 exempt, but due in 2028, I'm assuming, and tier 2 covered in 2027.
That's a great question. There are quite a few amendments to the standard. We kind of drew out the major ones in this PowerPoint presentation here, but I do encourage people to peruse the draft rules. Again, they're marked up, so you'll see strike-throughs and underlinements and in some cases highlights and comments. These proposals do kind of cover some amendments to tier 1 exemptions, because when tier 1 exemptions were written, so the original legislation, it was without the knowledge that there would be a tier 2 or without the existence of tier 2. So as far as exemptions, and I'm going to back into the first question here, hopefully I got it all. Conditioned space is defined as heated or either directly or indirectly heated space. And what indirected heated space could be, let's say, a mechanical room or closet or a basement that may not actually have its own heating source in it, but it's adjacent to a floor or an area that does have direct heating, but there is no thermal barrier between those two spaces. So that would be indirectly heated space. It's adjacent to heated space without a thermal barrier. This is all defined in the standard and within the building codes. So that's kind of how we define heated or conditioned space. We do have an exemption for tier 1 and for tier 2 for buildings with I can't remember if it's less than 50,000 square feet of conditioned space or where 50% of the space is not conditioned or semi-conditioned. So with that exemption, if your building has the threshold for unconditioned space, and that would, or semi-heated space, and there is a definition for semi-heated space, and it's basically freeze protection heat, and it's defined in the standard as well. I think it's 3.5 BTUs per square foot or something like that. That is considered to be semi-heated space. You could aggregate that with the unconditioned space, and if you meet the threshold, you may be eligible for the exemption. Now, let's say you have a building that's exempt from tier 1 because it has 30,000 square feet of conditioned space, so it doesn't have over 50 anymore. That building may then be subject to tier 2, but not tier 1. So they would need to benchmark the building and apply the energy management plan, operations and maintenance program requirements to that building or so that's how the proposed language is for within Annex Z, tier 1. Amendments that we felt were necessary to account for the exemption that may drop a tier 1 building from tier 1 requirements that may require them to be subject to tier 2. So please take a look at those, peruse them, provide your comment. We'd appreciate that. I'm not sure I hit every part of that question, Nonlin. Can you refresh me?
Sorry, I wasn't prepared. I scrolled down to a different part. And the timing, okay. And how the timing applies for 60,000 with 30,000 of conditioned space, pretty much
Yeah.
tier two, you know.
Yeah, so if tier two is all the same compliance date of 2027, so regardless of whether it's anywhere between 20 and 50,000 square feet, they all have the same compliance date. So if you were dropped, an exemption dropped you out of tier one, but put you into tier two, it would be based on the general compliance date for tier two, which is 2027.
Okay.
Any other questions at this point, or should we move on?
We have some questions, not in the same topic, if you want to.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about building complex and the definition of that, right? Interconnect through conditioned space on contiguous property or sole ownership. So in this example here, we have a building complex. Let's see these connectors between these buildings is all conditioned space. So it's interconnected through conditioned space in scenario one. You aggregate the gross floor area for a total of 120,000 square feet. So that building complex is a tier one building with a compliance date of 2027. So scenario two, they're interconnected through conditioned space, but of separate ownership. This would not be a complex. We'd have two tier one buildings and one tier two building. There may be some, generally it's going to be easier for buildings owned by separate entities to comply individually, and that's how the rules are set up. But if there is any situation where a group of building owners of, they may be connected through shared meters or shared systems or something. I'm not sure if these scenarios exist, but there may be some room for Commerce to allow for compliance at that complex level that's not of sole ownership. So contact us as long as there may be some room for compliance in that path.
Okay. There was a question that came in. I'm not sure if it quite answers their question, but it's how can an individual building that has multiple owners comply with the building when the building is not set up for submetering by its original design? For example, shared building HVAC. So would it be like a complex? Jeff, you can feel free to go off of mute if you're here.
I think I understand the question from Jeff is, let's say we have let's just use a hospital, for example. They may have interconnected buildings of multiple ownership. So let's say we're looking at this building here and it's interconnected through conditioned space, but it has multiple owners.
Or even, Luke, even make it more simple. One freestanding building that has multiple owners of different floors, but was built as a single building and is not submetered for its energy use by its ownership, doesn't align with the ownership. And it's really not practical. It either forces us to sell one owner to another to comply. Can't really submeter systems that aren't subdivided like that. That's where that question is heading.
Yeah, no, great question. And that's where we put that may comply collectively or individually. We'd like there to be some flexibility that you comply collectively in that scenario. You would still be considered multiple covered buildings, right? So if any penalties were assessed, it would be based on the ownership. So if building owner A owned 50,000 square foot, they would be penalized based on that 50K. So perhaps you can work together to comply, let's say with the energy use intensity target collectively, or The standard allows you to comply through the investment criteria of the standard. So you would take your ownership, do an energy audit, and then install any cost-effective energy efficiency measures. That may be difficult if you're sharing systems.
Right.
But there is a pathway if you're only sharing meters.
But if we're sharing systems, I'm hearing you to say we could comply collectively. Is that, although penalties may be assessed on a prorated basis, we could apply collectively if we had an agreement between parties.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
No other questions. Luke?
Okay, next slide, please.
Okay. No other
Okay.
questions. I think we've
Take
covered all
it
the questions.
over, Annalyn.
Yeah, we've, if there's any questions that still out there, please feel free to put it in chat. Let's do next slide, Monica. Just going back, I just want to, again, this workshop is recorded, the slide deck recording, a link to the recording and the proposed rules will be on the website. They'll also be emailed to those who registered. Take some time to review the materials, submit comments through the comment form. For us to consider your comments before filing the CR 102, submit before September 29. And then for general questions, you could always email us at buildings@commerce.wa.gov, and then we're going to show that shortly. But a reminder, we're going to review the comments. We're going to do the CR 102. The public hearing is scheduled for November 1st, 2023. It helps to be subscribe to our bulletin where we announce these things, but otherwise you can just check back into our website, and that's where we'll be posting any kind of information. Judy, did I miss any other questions that you might have seen?
So I lost track of which ones you covered, and so I'm not being any help. I apologize.
That's okay.
Hope people will speak up if we miss their question.
Yeah,
Annalyn and Judy, maybe in the meantime, we've got a few minutes. Annika can share her screen with the actual draft document, and we can give participants that have not participated in previous workshop a snapshot beyond the screenshots that Judy included in her slides, kind of show you how the formatting works for the draft rules and how you can participate in providing comments.
okay. While she's queuing that up, Judy put the inbox email in the chat. Other than that, if you're familiar with the document and the draft language and how to comment, that's it for our presentation, and we thank you so much for participating. But go ahead, take it away, Luke.
All right, Annika, if you could just scroll down a bit and I'll tell you when to stop. Okay, you can note here that we have some sections in, I believe, red. I'm colorblind, so I'm guessing there, but it's certainly not blue. That are underlined. It's yellow, okay, and strike throughs that represent the amendments we've made. And where it says not presented in previous workshop, that's where Judy has noted that where we have made amendments based primarily on comments we've seen to date on proposed amendments. Go ahead and scroll a little bit more. I'll see if there's anything else I can point out quickly. Again, we're at section 3. We're looking at definitions here. Judy has noted where the definitions were added based on Senate Bill 5722 or amended based on Senate Bill 5722. Where there are applications that you can see compliance extension. We changed the language for that to conditional compliance, which I'm not sure I mentioned in detail today, but there is a pathway for tier 2 buildings. It's not a compliance extension, but it's conditional compliance that will allow tier 2 buildings in an extra 180 days to satisfy the compliance requirements. To be eligible for that conditional compliance, they need to apply, and in that application process, they need to submit Form A with their benchmarking requirements. And then they would be given an extended period of time to complete and implement their energy management plan and operations and maintenance program.
Luke, if I can add, just to
Yep.
flag for people, in the comment, I tried to highlight yellow those things that had been amended or different from originally presented in a workshop, so that people can see the flag the changes, so people can see them more easily. So that's an
Great.
example there with the tier 2 covered building section.
So these draft rules include every section of the standard that has any amendments or new tier 2 rule proposals in them. So we have not included things such as the normative, informative annex, D, E, sections that are not required by the standard, but are reference documents, unless we amended them. So there's just a couple, or if they are associated with amendments, such as we did include I don't know what annex it is, but it's the map of the climate zones in the country. We did include that, even though we didn't change the map. It is referenced in an amendment we made to the standard to identify climate zone 5C, which was not previously identified in the rules. I think that's all I had to say. Annika, if you want to go back to the presentation and show them our parting slide with contact information, that's fine. And again, formal questions that we will respond to are emailed to buildings@commerce.wa.gov. Formal comments will be considered, but you won't necessarily get a return email with an answer to questions there.
So on behalf of the Clean Buildings team, thank you for attending and for continuing to participate in our rulemaking workshop and submitting those comments. The team appreciates your time, attention, expertise as we develop the rules. We have workshops next week. It will be presented. We will present the same material. If you'd like to meet us in person, that would be wonderful to see you. If not, you'll receive this recording link in an email. So have a great rest of your day.
Luke, I do have one
Yes.
question.